Welcome, everyone. This is a great day for us to connect, and I want you all to know how grateful we are for you to be here. This is a panel that we're calling The Change We Must Make, that is focused on fatherhood, sexual violence, and moving beyond the protector role. On behalf of our panelists that you see before you, the filmmakers behind On the Record, those of us at Fathering Together, myself, Chris Lewis, John Badalament, we want to just say how grateful we are that you're participating in this critical conversation. My name is Brian Anderson. I'm the co-founder and executive director at Fathering Together. And we want you to know that we as an organization are committed to empowering fathers to be agents for change. And that change has to start with first educating ourselves. So that is why I'm so honored that we have these leaders, these educators, and such a great diversity within our community, all focused on this issue of gender violence, gender-based violence and sexual assault, and how we as fathers have a role in finding an end to this issue. And so I'm thrilled to introduce Emiliano Diaz de Leon. He will be our moderator today. He's also a dear friend, but most importantly, he is the men's engagement specialist at Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. He works there since 2008 as an individual focused on domestic violence and sexual assaults across Texas, with a focus on providing training and technical assistance on enhancing enhancing services to male survivors of sexual violence. He's been doing this work for over 2 decades and comes with a wealth of experience that I know he'll bring to us today. And so with that, Emiliano, please take us away. Thank you for being here.
Fathering Together for hosting this really important conversation. I am really honored to be with you today as your moderator of this panel discussion. Before we begin, I want to introduce our panelists. So today I'm really honored to be joined by Drew Dixon. Drew is a music producer, a television producer, a writer, and a #MeToo silence breaker. And during her career in the music industry, Drew oversaw the recording of the most important, the greatest hip hop records and artists, that in history, I would say, because I'm a huge hip hop head. And so thank you so much for that music, because it really has been part of my life. She was a vice president of A&R Arista Records, a director of A&R at Def Jam Recordings, and general manager of John Legend's independent record label, Homeschool Atlantic, where she oversaw the recording of Estelle's Grammy-winning single, American Boy, one of my favorite jams. So thank you for that music. In 2017, Drew broke her silence in the New York Times about sexual assault and harassment in the music industry. She's the main subject of the HBO Max documentary On the Record, directed by Academy Award nominated filmmakers Amy Ziering and Kirby Dick. She's also an honors graduate of Harvard Business School's MBA program and a graduate of Stanford University. Drew lives in Brooklyn, New York. Shout out Brooklyn, where she is writing a memoir for HarperCollins and producing music and other original content for her new multimedia company called Claim. Thank you so much for being with us, Drew. In addition, we are joined by Quentin Q. Walcott. Q is the executive director of Connect. It's a leading national and international anti-violence activist, educator, and writer. A hallmark of Q's work over the past 22 years has been engaging men and boys as allies, activists in the movement to prevent intimate and gender-based violence. The foundation of Q's work is a focus on the intersections of violence, race, and gender, and its impact on marginalized communities. Quinn is one of the US leaders selected by the Novo Foundation to participate in its groundbreaking Move to End Violence initiative, a 10-year program to strengthen the movement to end gender-based violence in the United States. He's also a co-founder and chief organizer of the New York City and National Father's Day Pledge Against Violence. It's an amazing campaign. An annual event established in 2010, which is observed in 50 plus US cities. Q was a speaker at the first White House United States of Women Summit back in 2016, on gender inequality and shared the dais with TV actor and activist Matt McGorry. Q has participated in international anti-violence forums and led trainings in Brazil, Canada, Fiji, France, India, Kenya, St. Martin, South Africa, Switzerland, and Thailand. Just an amazing work. So thank you so much for being with us, Quinn. Finally, we are joined by Didan Brunner. Didan is an attorney, mediator, and a single co-parent of a 10-year-old dynamo. I love that word. He enjoys photography, writing, exploring the nation's capital with his daughter Ella. When he's not creating content for the blog on fathering or working on the next episode of Dad Gene's podcast, definitely subscribe to that. He's a native Californian, DC transplant, and can be found romping through Rock Creek Park, which sounds great, on a top secret spy mission, very mysterious, with his kiddo, or training for his next triathlon. Thank you so much, Didan, for joining us. So thank you all so much for being with us today. And thank you for those who have joined us for this panel discussion. If you have questions based on what you are hearing in the conversation today, please put them in the chat and we'll address them towards the end of the panel discussion. So I want to begin with the first question. For our first question, I'd like to begin with you, Drew. So this film allows the viewer to bear witness to the trauma of sexual violence and truth-telling to power. Why is your story so important to boys and men?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for your work and for the work of all of the panelists. Well, I'm going to try to back my way into an answer. Yes, the film does bear witness to the trauma of the underlying sexual violence and also the trauma of coming forward, which I don't think I fully appreciated when I made the decision reluctantly, would be its own separate sort of wrecking ball of trauma, sort of ripping off a poorly formed sort of, a poorly healed sort of re-breaking the bone to heal it properly is really what I've been going through for the past 4 years. So I'm grateful that has been documented. And why is it important for men and boys? So many reasons. First of all, men and boys can be survivors of sexual violence. So I want to be clear about that. And while it was important for me to center the unique vulnerability of Black men and girls in this film, I also want to be clear and acknowledge the unique vulnerability and the specific sort of version of shame that is carried by male survivors. Furthermore, I think it's really important for Black men and boys, all men, frankly, all men and boys, in particular, maybe not just Black men and boys, because this is really where that buzzword allyship comes into play. I have a 17-year-old daughter, I have a 15-year-old son, and I've advised them to the best of my ability how to handle situations where they could be at risk. You can tell your daughter how to conduct herself to be safe from sexual violence. There's all of the mythology about what to wear, what to say, how to act, where to go. You can tell your 15-year-old Black son how to be safe from racial profiling, and there's all of the mythology about what to wear, how to act, how to comply. But you also ultimately understand, as a mother of a daughter and a son, 2 Black teenagers, there's really nothing I can do. I can pray, frankly, that they don't encounter a rapist or a racist. And so really the power, sadly, lies in the hands of the abusers in both cases. And so I don't have access as a woman to locker rooms and locker room talk and the kinds of places where the behavior that ultimately culminates in violence is incubated and enabled and tacitly sort of endorsed. And men do. So you guys are in those rooms and you guys are in those conversations, and I need your help to change the culture long before my daughter or myself ends up in an environment where we are making, terrifying decisions, really already having lost the fight. So that's why it's important. And I'd say one last thing, it's important because we're watching you guys. You know, when I was in the music business, there are a lot of men who've contacted me to say they're so sorry about what happened, and I appreciate that. They also sat in rooms where Russell Simmons and L.A. Reid made lewd comments, where they denigrated and objectified me and other women in the room. And they laughed or they smiled or they looked down at their shoes. And that told me that I had nowhere to turn. And so that's where I think men can be really an important part of the solution in a way that women, no matter what we do, can't possibly turn this around on our own.
I think that's an important message for the boys and men who are watching this, and for us that are engaged in this work. I think it's an important message to hear from not just from you, but from other survivors of sexual violence, that we can't just support you and other survivors silently. We need to have an active role in ending sexual violence, especially with the boys and men in our lives. So I really appreciate you speaking to that, and again, for your courage in coming forward and sharing your story, because I found it to be profound and devastating, and really painful to know that you experienced, you and the other women that are profiled in the documentary experienced that type of violence and abuse from men that, like probably many who are hip hop heads, you know, that love the culture, that are part of the culture, I think really admired those men. And I think, you know, I think that was, we have a responsibility of holding those individuals accountable, and continuing to do so. And I really appreciate your courage and the courage of the survivors that are doing that work, and men need to join you and stand with you in holding those individuals accountable within the culture. So thank you again. So for Q and Dedan, as fathers with daughters, right? Like so many folks who are connected to Fathering Together, who are watching this, are fathers themselves or father figures or guardians. What is your take on the importance of Drew's story, right? So I'd love to hear from you guys.
Thanks, Emiliano and Drew. Thank you for telling your story and taking that risk, because I think that's what we're here to talk about. What is the risk of telling your story, and what is a risk to holding someone accountable? I think it's a lot of it is, I think I had this whole thing in my mind of what I was going to say, but something that Drew said was, I think a lot of the crux of the work is the individual man and what they think and what they say and how they care, how they emote and how they feel, versus that same man in a group of other men. Like you talked about, people calling you individually and saying, oh, this is terrible, I'm sorry this happened to you. But who are we when we're in a group of other men? Are we the same way? Are we feeling the same way? Are we worried about, if I stand up for Drew, what other men will say to me, right? And, you know, a hip hop head as well, like you, Emiliano, I'm sure Dedan as well. And it's like, you know, when we talk about the culture and hip hop culture and hip hop industry and where they intersect is where a lot of the problems come from, right? And I think that the idea of even Drew being so skilled, you know, from the film you talked about from a very young age, while, you know, listening to music with your parents, jazz and all types of music. And that, you know, that's me as well, right? That's a lot of us, and we know music, we believe in it, it's in our blood. But then when you grow up, you think about what are the locations for me to be in the music business, me as a Black male, and then thinking about Drew as a Black woman, you know, what are the different entry points that are available to us? And that's looking at, you know, the racial piece and also the race and gender piece. So for me, it's like, what do I want to get out of this? And it's really about, the question of what accountability looks like, what does justice look like, what does repair look like, right? Reparations in some form or fashion for Drew and Salai and all these other women and that we know of and that we don't know of. What does that look like? So a lot of it is that conversation and taking the onus and responsibility away from Drew to tell her story and to hopefully be believed and not blamed, because part of the culture that we talk about is also a blaming culture. It's also rape culture exists within that culture as well, and also blaming, survivors for being in, quote unquote, being in those situations. And like this toll of, Russell is who he is, right? He's an important figure for multiple reasons. And not to say that because he's important, he is not complicated, of course, and can be harmful as he was. But we have to kind of, in putting Drew in a situation and all of us in a situation of how do I hold somebody like Russell accountable and also recognize how he exists as a Black person within, hip hop industry and business altogether. So holding all of that, I think is a lot to figure out and what makes this conversation so difficult. But to my young daughter, it's like, I want to create this world where we are allies, we are, working together to figure out this human situation and this human problem that we have. So a lot of it is like having these conversations, discussions, and not being afraid to do that, right? And to again, for men who are doing most of the harm, and that's a reality we have to look at, right? And it's not just Black men in a lot of these cases in terms of hip hop industry and business and capitalism are repeating a lot of the same things that we're trying to move away from. And what makes Russell Simmons and Def Jam and other Black companies and leaders significant in a capitalist world that doesn't look at Black people or women or minorities or poor people in the same light. So we want to create these spaces, but not replicate the harm that is done to all of us, and particularly for men of color and Black men, to recreate the harm that and bring it out against women of color.
If I can add briefly, as from being boys, we've always been taught the importance of protecting those close to us. The fights that we got into because somebody talked about our mother, the jokes that we make when we find out that when someone's having a daughter, suggesting getting a gun. But where we fail miserably is extending that protection to women who aren't in our circle, who aren't in our family, who aren't close to us. And I think what the film does is it shows not just the importance, but the necessity to have systems that, one, believe women when they come forward with allegations, but two, are prepared to take those allegations and investigate them. There was a guy in the film who Drew talked to early, but if he doesn't have the power to investigate, if he doesn't have the power to take what was shared with him and put action behind it, then the system fails. And so that's something that the documentary just kind of underscored over and over and over for me. I appreciated the ability to see it, but I'm so sorry that the circumstances that went into its creation.
Emiliana, if I could just underscore something that Dan said, and I think it's right on point. It's like, we kind of like territorialize who we care about, like you said. So if it's not mine, it's not my daughter, it's not my cousin, it's not my mom, we kind of like, we have a short attention span around the major issue. So I think what the Dan is saying is like, it's like I need to care about the little girl or the woman in Brooklyn in the same ways I care about the little girl in Brazil or the woman in Brazil or the young girl in Africa. We have to kind of move beyond, our ownership and our kind of territory, so to speak, and make it more about not just ours, but all young girls, all young women, all people being harmed. So I think that's a great point to that.
Yeah, I had something else I want to say, but I don't want to talk too long if you have a question.
No, go ahead. I was that you read my mind. I was about to ask you if you had any additional comments to what Q and Dadon said.
Well, I'm thinking again about like the role of men and the complexity of taking a stand as a Black person in a community where there are targets in the backs of all of our men. There are targets on all of our backs. But there is a specific type of target on the back of Black men and boys. But I also think about what I talked about in the film when I went to see the slave castles in Ghana. And I went into that little condemned cell where the Black men who tried to defend the enslaved Black women and girls, because they were average age of 15, to be clear, as they were systematically raped in the courtyard as an economic decision. Forget the sadism of it. It was just good business to rape a Black woman or pubescent girl. That's not true for, I don't think, anybody else on the face of the earth for hundreds of years. Okay. They were taken in a cell and left to die, the men who defended us. And so I'm like, okay, and now you fast forward to 2002, and there's a sex tape of a 14-year-old Black girl being abused and urinated on by R. Kelly. And barbershops across the country, they laugh. They circulate the tape. They sell it on tables in the hood. They sell it on tables right next to Bibles and Qurans, right? And I'm not here to say that I was any better because I was new to the music business. I was young. I never saw the tape. I don't want to see the tape. But I sort of took a cue from the community laughing off the tape that somehow that was the right thing to do. And there's this whole idea that calling out Russell Simmons and L.A. Reid or Bill Cosby, I'm keeping it real, is anti-Black. You know what's anti-Black? Laughing at a 14-year-old Black girl being abused and defiled, and us having no indignation as a people. Dave Chappelle makes a video, a skit about it. I used to know Dave. You know what I mean? I thought Dave was cool. And we laughed. It told us as a culture, it bought us all in to laughing, and the lack of indignation around the defilement and the sexual abuse of Black women and girls goes back to those slave castles. We were taught to laugh, to ignore it. And so there is nothing more anti-Black in the world than our own community lacking indignation every time we hear that one of our own has been defiled. And as long as we laugh, as long as we look at our shoes, as long as we don't say anything, we are doing the work of white supremacy. That's the issue. And that's where it's not a conflict, but that is the trap that has been set for us as a people. And that is where I need my men and my boys to step up, because we're only helping them. I think like the cheat code for our liberation as a people is Black women and men standing together. I think that's the cheat code. And so, I also think it's probably not a coincidence. I don't know. I'm not saying Russell wasn't good at his job. I worked with him. He's very smart. I learned a lot from him. But I think there's something to be said for the ones who made it, the ones who became moguls, were misogynist, were sort of self-loathing in a certain way. I mean, I'm going to be really real. Look at who Russell raped. White adjacent appearing Black women. So he has a fetish for white appearing Black women, but he also knows that we don't have Amy Cooper's get out of jail free card. I can't invoke real white womanhood. I kind of look like that, but I don't really have any of the protections of an actual white woman. And they know that. That's anti-Black. So.
Yeah, thank you, Drew. I think it's really important for the boys and men who might be watching this, for us just to reflect on what Drew is saying, and to really understand that silence is complicity, is complacency, right? And I think that is the challenge for those who are watching on the record and watching this panel discussion, to really to say something, to do something, to intervene, to hold those individuals accountable, whoever they may be, whether they're individuals that we know and that we love and that we live with, right? I think there's a really unique opportunity for us to engage in conversations with both Drew, during this panel discussion, and with each other as men, right? Especially as men of color, and having this hard, sometimes uncomfortable conversation, because I know those feelings came up for me while watching the documentary. And understanding that I too have a responsibility, that I fit into the culture. I bought into these ideals, I bought into these ideas around masculinity, especially within the hip hop culture and community, right? I'm part of that, right? And so I think an ongoing conversation that we need to have with each other and other survivors of sexual violence. So thank you, Drew, for that. So Q, I wanna, there's a lot of messages in this film. It covers a lot of ground beyond sexual violence, such as the intersections that you were saying earlier of race and gender, its role in silencing women of color in coming forward. So Q, I'd like for you to answer our next question first, but what do you hope specifically Black men take away from this film? And what do you fear or worry that they will take away from this film? Like, do you have concerns as well about the message that they're walking away with from the film? Or so I'm just curious your thoughts on that, and then if other folks want to add some additional thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think it's like a lot of what you were saying is like when we think about race, we typically think about Black men, right? And we think about gender, we only think about women, right? So it seems like the onus and responsibility becomes about Black women around harm done to them sexually or domestic violence, whatever it may be. So it becomes this women's issue. But the reality is that, and I'm just speaking for heterosexual straight males in this scenario, but we are doing most of the harm in those heterosexual relationships. So we have to kind of think about, this is not a women's issue, this is really a men's issue. So I want men to walk away around what is it about us, how we're socialized, how we're raised, how we're valued, and how we value women, right? So a lot of it is about the value. And it's also, I think Dre was alluding to it, like violence against women is profitable, right? And not just in a financial way, but in terms of self-value, self-worth, self-esteem, and it builds that up falsely. And really, in terms like the music business, the profitability of misogynoir or misogyny, particularly towards Black women, is profitable. You know what I mean? No matter what kind of genre of music it may be the hardcore, it may be the gangster, but it may even be the conscious. A lot of conscious rappers, yield to, let me say something about a woman or a girl, right? So a lot of it is about our attitudes and our belief systems that kind of say it's okay. And I want men and boys to realize that yes, race is a paramount issue. It's not something that us men or brown men or men of color deal with, but women deal with this equally or even more so and get less attention around it because they are women and value less in this. And I think that the piece that Drew was straight up about and other women that was centered in the film about, colorism and the closeness to whiteness gives you more visibility. And like the dark-skinned girl who may be experiencing this as well may not have the same avenues. So a lot of multiple themes, like it's talking about Emiliano, is part of this. And I just want to reiterate, what can true accountability look like? And also what does redemption look like? Because that's also part of the conversation around accountability versus cancel culture and repair. What does Drew need in this scenario to be whole and well and to have the same opportunities as a Russell or Cosby or whoever we're talking about? This is just the latest example of their ability to make money over 20 years, 30 years, when the person who's on the recipient of the harm is dealing with the trauma and the triggers and the not being whole and questioning and the hypervigilance that prohibits them to be living well and thriving economically and emotionally. So I just want Black men and Black boys to walk away with more questions, not just this us against them, this enemy consciousness, men against women, moms against dads, boys against girls, is that we are in this together and we are harming each other. And how can we, work towards healing and being whole again?
Yeah, thank you, Q. Does anybody want to add anything else to that?
So I so appreciate what Q just said. I certainly won't try to add to it, but one of the things that I thought about is that the importance of seeing sexual assault and rape as an everybody problem and not a woman's problem. And to be specific, I'm not talking about because it happens to men and boys as well. That's certainly true. But these assaults and rapes against women are all of our problems. And unless we move in that space with that type of thinking, we're not really making efforts to stop it. We're not making efforts to dismantle it because we're disassociating ourselves from it. And so what that can look like is us really doing some scrubbing of our environment. Why are we going to barbershops and being comfortable in environments that we wouldn't want our daughter to be in without us? Or why are we in religious spaces that don't support or protect women that are in them? We have to ask ourselves these hard questions. It might mean having to cut your own hair. It might mean having a prayer group at a certain place or not going to the church that your great grandfather went to. But these are the types of steps that we have to be willing to take if we want to actually see something change. And to be specific, I want that for all men, not just for Black men. I think as Black men, we owe it to Black women to stand closer to them, to be protectors to them in ways that we haven't always had the opportunity to be, and in ways that we failed to be. But the actions that I think we need to take as all men.
Yeah, so I want to encourage folks who are watching this, right, just to reflect on what it is that you can do, that small thing that you can do to engage in this conversation with the brothers in your life, right? Even if it's just sharing this panel discussion with them, getting with the men in your life and having this conversation, watching the film together and having a dialogue about what is coming up for them and what is it that they can do to change the culture, not just in the hip hop community, but I think the broader music industry, in our society, in our communities, like Didan was saying, in our places of worship, our workplaces, our schools, etc. I think there's a lot of opportunities for us as men, specifically as fathers, not just to engage in these conversations with our daughters, but with our sons. As a parent of a 12-year-old boy, after watching this film and really thinking about the music that I consumed, right? And those messages around women, and particularly women of color, at what point do I want to encourage my son to consume that music, right? And that was so important in terms of my development, in terms of my identity, my sense of community, the sort of our history within the culture, and how do I have that conversation with them, right? How do I expose them to that music and engage in an honest, sometimes hard and uncomfortable conversation about the misogyny and the sexism and the racism and the other forms of violence that I consumed as a boy in the music that I love. And so I think those are the bigger, broader conversations for us to have. It's also with the girls and women in our lives, and how that has impacted them. And I think one of the things I appreciate about the documentary, Drew, and Jane Doe Films, is that we're able to reflect on that to really look at the whole culture, to understand the history and the impacts on people in the culture in this country and around the world, right? Because it's not just people don't just consume hip hop here in the United States. So I want to wrap up with this question.
Emiliano, I think Drew had a question for you.
Please, yeah, Drew.
really quickly that I love what Didon, am I saying it right?
Mhm.
Didon said about making sure that you're not in spaces that are reinforcing toxic culture. At the same time as somebody, I'm raising a 15-year-old son, 17-year-old daughter, you know, I always want to make sure that while I'm all, you know, the future's female and that's cool, and I want to make space for my daughter, I also want to make space for him to be himself, you know, and not to feel like he's like a villain just because like he's a cis hetero male. And like in the same way that I want to make space for people who aren't cis hetero to show up authentically and be their true selves, I want him to be able to show up and be his true self. And so he's masculine and that's cool, but just don't be toxic masculine. Like that's my thing. Just like, you know, I love hip hop, like love it to the ground. But can we just try to keep the swag and the flavor without the abuse, without the toxic like nihilism that's like not only bad for women, but like that's also like not great for us, like as a people. And so I'm definitely a fan, and I think about this a lot as a mother, you know, of 2 kids of different genders, right? Making space for people to show up authentically, you know, but also just checking yourself. Are we being boys together, which is cool? I support that. Do you? Are we being girls together, young women together? Are we being abusive together? Are we enabling a toxic gender identity together? And that's my thing. Just examine the toxic part. Let's keep the good part. So I just, you know, that's one thing I would like for the men and the boys to listen. I love y'all. Love y'all. Just don't be toxic. Yes, themselves. That's not good for you or us. But do you, you know?
So, whew, I want to just take a moment and take all of that in. I think that's important, just to sit with this for a little bit. And I can't tell you how important it is, for, you know, for this conversation to happen. So I'm gonna leave us with this last question, right? When we think about movement building, I think Drew is challenging us to step up and to speak out, and to speak with, not speak for, but to really stand with her and other survivors of sexual violence and sexual abuse. I'd like to hear from the 3 of you in terms of what is it that, and we'll start with you, Drew, in terms of what more can we do, right? Both with this film, and what can we do to change the culture, in your opinion?
You know, again, I just think it's really kind of what I was saying before. Just examine yourself, examine your environment, examine your friend group, your community group, your work environment. Are you co-signing toxic, sort of status quo, patriarchal, harmful behavior, language, practices? And just like, you don't suck, you're not terrible. We're not going to just start and be perfect in one instant. Just start to pay attention in the same way that we're all learning and evolving. Like I'm learning, my kids get mad at me now because I sometimes get the pronouns wrong. You're like, Mom, we told you. Like, you know, that person in my grade is them now. Stop misgendering them. I'm like, my bad. Like, I'm not trying to mess it up, but I'm learning, right? So just pay attention, be open, be aware, and do better. Like, just don't do harm. And that's it. Just, that's what I would ask. That's just, it's a small thing. But I think that would make a real difference if men particularly do that, because you guys have the power. It is the patriarchy. So if you could just pay attention.
In Q, is there a specific message that you would relay to fathers who might be watching?
Sure, and I'll be brief because I know we're short on time. There's a concept when trying to get healthier, you know, they say each day that passes, you either got a little healthier or a little less healthy. You know, a lot of men, and I include myself, sometimes believe that, oh, well, I didn't do anything, I was just there. Or maybe you're a bystander, or maybe you left the room. But the question is, what did you do to dismantle that environment? This is an environment where predators thrive. This is an environment where victims aren't given credibility. I mean, literally, Me Too, and I'm not knocking the movement by any stretch, but it's the suggestion that more credibility comes when people are coming forth to tell their story. The reality is we should have an environment where one person with allegations is taken seriously and is given credibility. It shouldn't take 60. It shouldn't take 10. And you're like, let's see what happens next week. So what we can do is we can create environments where people are deemed credible the first time they share something. And two, we can ask ourselves, what do we do to make the world a little safer? That's my piece.
Thanks for that. It's so much in such a short period of time, but I would just say, I think, masculinity was brought up, toxic masculinity, and it's masculinities, right? I think during the course of a day, if you think about when you wake up in the morning and you're in a house that is safe, what mask do you put on? Are you closer to your truest self? Or if there's violence or something going on, you put on another mask for protection, right? So a lot of times I think we need to think about, so what they're saying is like, where are we in these spaces? How do we show up? How do we contribute to it or not? But I think, we have to be try to be self-aware and not let the privilege that we have as men and even as Black men that we have, the entitlements that we have, the expectations of how it's to be, to get in the way of a self-assessment. So sometimes I think we need to be talking to, men that will hold us accountable, that'll be real with you, that won't kind of co-sign, Q's bullshit, but like, Q, that was messed up, and this is why I had your back in the moment. But when we get home, I'm gonna tell you about yourself. We need people like that around us, men and women. And I think we also need to be in conversations with women. Like, I want to talk more to Drew about what her experience was like. And it's not that I don't even know, right? Because at some point, because of my privilege and the harm that I do, I know how that benefits me and does harm to her, right? But I want to talk a little bit more about that so we can together figure out, and not put the onus on her to tell me what I need to do and how I should be living and the way I should think. I think we need to be real as men about, we have certain advantages that the women and our loved ones don't have. And think about that. That whole idea of walk a mile in my shoes is not literally, but like theoretically, I want to have that conversation with you so I can experience it more and see how I show up in that room and what else I can do to hold my brothers accountable and men in spaces like I have, not a self-plug, but like Men's Roundtable, where we talk about these issues all the time, the range of masculinities, accountability. And we need to heal as well, because we're harmed as well. That idea of hurt men, hurt people is real, right? So we have to think about how can we be whole and well to be better fathers, to be better people in our relationships and better people in our communities. So part of it is about a self-assessment, and then for folks to hold us accountable, accountability partners that, just like the entourage does not support or supports negative behavior in those situations. I need an entourage that's gonna be like, yo, Q, what you're doing is messed up. Stop that. And we're not gonna allow you to do this because it's harming not only the person you're about to harm, but yourself. I think that's the trick for men and boys. My work is showing how this behavior impacts them even more so it impacts women and girls.
I just want to say one more thing about that too. And I know there was a question just about this is sort of going back full circle to the beginning. For men, sort of one of the most heartbreaking things that I've experienced is not just, as I was talking before the panel started, about some of the Black leadership that I think has just failed to speak out in support of Black women survivors, and particularly those of us who've been assaulted by high-profile Black men, where we really could have used that support and it didn't happen. So you guys are the real leaders, those people who were real famous, who I thought would step up, did not. So I'm grateful for you. But I also have been heartbroken in personal relationships with men, and particularly two men who I dated back in the day, exes who surfaced when they heard about my story, were upset that I had one who I had told and one who I hadn't. wanted to go to Bali and kill Russell Simmons. I was like, first of all, that's not helpful. And secondly, no, you're not going to go there. But then both cheered when Bill Cosby was released. And so my sort of comment for men there is, and I really thought these men were like on my side. And I'm like, oh no, they're not really against rape or rape culture. They have beef on like a personal territorial level. This is toxic masculinity. This isn't actually empathy for me. This is, I am their ex, and they want to like vindicate their personal manhood with Russell Simmons, but they're cool with Bill Cosby, and they're cool with Michael Jackson. They're cool with rape culture. So like, don't be that guy. Like, don't be that guy. And that was truly heartbreaking, because that happened to me twice with men who I'm like, okay, this brother has my back. And I was like, oh, psych. I don't feel safe with those men anymore. And then I'm going to quickly try to answer this question. It is not the answer you guys probably want. How did my father and mother react to this film and my story? In real time, when I first told them in 1995, they were livid. And in fact, they knew that I sued Russell for sexual harassment in 1997, settled for $3,000. It was just an Amex bill that they'd opened in my name and put like Method Man's flight and Michael Jordan's hotel and stuff on it, and wouldn't pay it because I quit in duress after the rape. I sued to get the $3,000 bill paid because my Arista wages were being garnished. And then my lawyer took 25, and I didn't even round up to the nearest dollar because I didn't want a cent from Russell Simmons. So my parents were supportive of that. The film, they did not want me to do it. This is not the kind of press or exposure that, you know, fancy Black families want. I am estranged from my father. I'll just say that, and I'll leave that there for reasons that are not unrelated to some of the things we're talking about here. So, you know, and that's why I care so much about survivors, not just of famous, you know, celebrities, but little girls, little boys, because I've lived that as well.
Really appreciate you answering that question. I also want to encourage folks who might be watching this panel discussion, if you or someone you know is a victim or survivor of sexual violence, I want to please encourage you to contact RAINN at 1-800-656-4673 or RAINN, RAINN.org for support and resources. Your story matters, and there is support available to survivors of sexual violence and sexual abuse, and would encourage you to share that information with your friends and family. Please would encourage you to follow Fathering Together across your social media platforms, as well as go to fatheringtogether.org for updates, information, resources to join the important work that Fathering Together is doing with men who are fathers, father figures, and guardians. Thank you so much to the panel.
Can I
Please,
say
Drew.
one more thing as a word of
Yes.
advice to anyone out there who's experiencing or has experienced sexual violence, or may think that they have, and they're not totally sure, or they've observed it. If you have access to email, this is a question I've gotten a lot, and it's what I've come up with as my answer. Email yourself. If you're not ready to call RAINN, if you don't know who you can trust, if you're not sure you want to say it out loud, my advice is email yourself. The subject line can be yuck, whatever, something weird that happens. And if it happens again, reply to your own email. And if you got 4 or 5 emails on that thread, that's when I really want you to start thinking about sharing that thread with somebody that you can trust. And you've solved a couple of problems for yourself. 1, you have time-stamped it. You have actually created some evidence. 2, you have spared yourself the re-traumatization of having to go all the way back to the beginning and tell somebody the story, because you've emailed yourself in real time. And 3, one thing that predators do is they groom you, and they'll do like a little thing, like they'll say something kind of off brand, or they'll touch you in a slightly sideways way. And then 4 or 5 emails later, they've actually violated your physical space. And you might be shocked if you compare email number 5 that you are calling yuck to email number 1 to realize how far away from your own north set point you've gotten. So this is something, I've gotten this question a lot, and I've come up with this as the answer. If you're not ready to call RAINN, email yourself, create a thread, keep going. And then you have that when you're ready to take it to the next level, when you find somebody that you think is safe or you're ready to call Ray.
For anyone who is watching that has experienced sexual violence or sexual abuse, I think that's some really important advice. And again, thank you also very much for participating in this panel. For Drew, thank you. Didon, thank you. And Q, thank you so much. And to Fathering Together and Jane Doe Films, thank you so much for this important discussion. We look forward to continuing to encourage you to follow all of us on social media, and to continue asking questions and sharing your thoughts about the film. And we hope that you have a happy holidays. Thank you.